Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today we're gonna try and see if scripting a video works for me, which, not gonna lie, a little bit nervous. The reason for that is because today I have a discussion video for you, and I actually wanted to structure my thoughts and what I'm gonna say before sitting down to film, so that I can then try to maybe be less confusing compared to usually in my discussion videos. Today's discussion video is going to be the first in a series surrounding gender and sexuality in fantasy. This little series is going to be kind of a subset to my series Let's Talk Culture in Fantasy, in which I use what I learned in my Bachelor of Social and Cultural Anthropology and kind of try to apply that to modern fantasy, or maybe also not so modern fantasy books. As always, the link to the playlist is in the description box down below as well as up there, so if you're interested in seeing which other topics I have covered so far, you're welcome to check those links out. Now, the sub-series I want to start today is going to consist of 3 videos. The first video, and also today's video, is going to cover sexuality in fantasy. The second video is going to be about gender identity and fantasy. And the third and last one is then going to be about gender expression, gendered spaces, and gender roles in general in fantasy. One last thing to mention before we get into the actual topic of today's video. Today's video is going to be split into 2 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk more about representation of queerness in fantasy. I will talk more about representation of queerness in general, but then we'll also try to talk about sexuality and representation of different sexualities in specific in fantasy. And then in the second part, I want to talk more about how authors decide to include different sexual identities within their fantasy worlds. As always, these are just my general musings, my general thoughts, sometimes not even strictly opinions. And with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the video. So the first question I want to ask is whether or not we have arrived at a point within the last few years where there is now no longer an excuse to not include queer characters into your books. And there was actually a little bit of a discussion going on around this question on Twitter a few days ago, but not concerning fantasy books, but more so concerning YA and contemporary YA books. Here, the argument on one side was that we have 2021. There really should not be an excuse anymore to not include queer characters into your books. But on the other hand, we also had the argument that that in a way is a very Western and Eurocentric take, and that especially a lot of queer BIPOC authors, maybe for them it's not safe to include queer characters into their books, and through that maybe out themselves, which then of course could end up being dangerous for them. Now, I have to say, I don't want to go into that discussion exactly, but I still thought that I'd add it for a bit of context and also for food of thought. Also, I just want to reiterate once again that everything I say in this video is just general thoughts that I make myself. I do not in any way, shape or form pretend to have the ultimate truth on any of these topics, especially since when it comes to marginalized experiences, these experiences, yes, there is a type of collective experience in a way, but these experiences are also very much very individual, especially when we talk about intersectionality and multiple marginalizations coming together. There are just experiences there that I obviously cannot talk about. But because of that, right up front, I of course want to say, if you have any thoughts on anything that I say in this video, leave them in the comments down below. I always very much enjoy hearing your thoughts on my discussion videos because, you know, my thoughts mostly come from my experiences, and with someone else having different experiences, their thoughts on topics will of course be sometimes similar to mine, sometimes very different. So something I have with fantasy is that fantasy, of course, especially high fantasy, is often set within thought up, made up worlds. Because of that, I feel like it's often especially important to acknowledge that queerness at least exists within those worlds, because otherwise it'd be just as easy for the reader to think that the author just wrote queerness out of their world. Does that make sense what I mean? And so because of that, setting aside the argument that for some authors, of course, it can be dangerous to out themselves like that, because of that, I feel in fantasy especially, there's really no excuse to not at least acknowledge queerness within your world. For me, that doesn't even necessarily mean that there has to be a named character that is queer. Acknowledging for me can mean that, for example, the king or queen of said country has a lover who is of the same gender and mentioning that. For me, acknowledging can mean that you have a character who talks about another character that they knew that has transitioned in the course of their lives. Just those very simple, sometimes maybe even more throwaway sentences can already be used to make clear that queerness within a fantasy world exists. Because I'm lucky enough to be queer and to never have that be a reason that my life was threatened or that my existence was threatened, I of course cannot speak to whether or not including queerness like that in fantasy novels already is something that could be a danger to some other queer people. But I still do think that including queerness into your fantasy in this way is the easiest way. Does that make a fantasy book queer in my opinion? Not necessarily. Depends on who the author is. But it's a start, you know? It's a start that I think almost anyone can do. The second option to include queerness in your fantasy novel is, of course, to write queer side characters, even just minor side characters. Although I probably will have to say that if you as an author, as a straight author, don't think you can write queer characters without resorting to stereotypes, like, rather go for this option than go for a queer main character just for woke points. You know what I mean? And then lastly, obviously, the third option is to include queer main or POV characters. I don't think I gotta add too much to that. And also, everything I have said so far concerns queerness in general, and now we'll talk a little bit more specifically about sexuality. Honestly, in my opinion, in terms of sexuality in fantasy, of representation of sexuality in fantasy, we have already seen a lot of improvement in the past few years. That isn't to say, though, that there isn't still even more space for improvement. Also, something I have noticed is when it comes to fantasy compared to contemporaries, we will much more rarely get a confirmed label within the text of a character. And I do want to talk about that whole aspect of LGBT within a non-Western modern context more in my next video, but I think we're all aware that it's quite rare for a character within a fantasy to be labeled as lesbian, gay, bi, pan, ace, whatever label. And honestly, in my personal opinion, that's not really that much of a problem because there's plenty of other ways to differentiate between the different sexualities without using a specific label. I mean, maybe not as much with bi and pansexuals, but you know, you get the gist. Also, something I want to talk about is that while I do see a lot of improvements, something I have also noticed within fantasy novels is that there's an imbalance of representations, let's say it like that. That there's some labels that will be represented a lot more often compared to others. As long as queer characters were relegated to the sidelines and didn't have many bigger roles within the fantasy stories, I definitely saw more gay characters. but by now, sapphic characters, especially lesbian characters, definitely have the upper hand on my bookshelves. I can right now tell you way more adult high fantasy with sapphic characters as main characters, both on my bookshelves as well as books that I just know from hearsay, compared to Achillean characters. Gay and bi characters seem to still be mostly relegated to the sidelines, especially bisexual male characters. I do want to acknowledge, however, that one of the reasons why I can tell you so many sapphic characters right now is also because of the absolutely backbreaking work that a lot of sapphic content creators have done to get the names of these books, of these authors, out into the world and to have people talk about those books. So that's definitely something that I do want to acknowledge. And also, even though I just mentioned that I have observed a certain imbalance between the representation of different sexualities, I do think that pitting representations against each other is never a good idea. So I don't think that saying we now have enough sapphic characters, give us more Achillean characters, is the goal or should be the goal. Because yes, as I have said, things have improved, but ultimately we still don't have enough representation of any sexuality. Well, aside from heterosexuality, of course, but you know, queer sexualities. So maybe this is also the right time to talk about how I feel if a fantasy doesn't even have the most basic acknowledgement of queerness or inclusion of queerness within their stories. Now, the thing I would say is that if I enjoyed a fantasy, not having queer characters won't make me enjoy the fantasy less. However, if it does have queer characters, it will definitely make me enjoy the book even more. On the other hand, if I already didn't like the book, it having queer characters probably won't make me like it that much more, gotta be honest. However, if I don't like a book, and on top of that, it doesn't have queer characters, that's just another minus point in the long list of minus points, and it will make me like the book even less. That's actually what happened to me with The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, because I didn't like the book, I thought it was boring, and then on top of that, it also didn't have queer characters, which might have made a book marginally more interesting for me. So there's one last point I want to talk about before we get into queerness or sexualities and world building compared to sexualities and representation. Although, of course, the two of them are definitely connected and you can't see them completely separately. So I mentioned earlier that I think within fantasy worlds, queer characters are easier to write compared to contemporary novels. The reason why I think that is because of this tiny little thing that happens a lot within fantasy called world building. This means that authors basically have the freedom to make up their own world. That means that they have the freedom to create a world that is not cis heteronormative, which honestly is a great thing. You do not have to build a world based on the discriminations of our world. And the thing is, in my opinion, when it comes to writing queer characters, where it becomes a bit dicey if you're maybe not queer yourself, is if you have to write queer characters having the experiences that a lot of queer people have within our world because we are queer. That's really, in my opinion, what makes us different from heterosexuals. This is, after all, why we started sometimes labeling books as own voices, because we wanted to be able to say, hey, here is an author who wrote the experiences of the characters from their own experience. And I won't get into the own voices discussion. I have already done 2 videos on this, which both will be linked down below and up there if you're interested in knowing my personal opinion around the own voices label. So coming back to writing experiences, while I do think that's not necessarily true for all queer identities, I think especially when it comes to a lot of different sexualities, the thing that makes our experiences with our sexuality different from straight people is not the fact that we're attracted to the same gender or attracted to multiple genders. I think what makes our experiences with our sexualities different is the fact that on the one hand we often have to deal with discrimination, and on the other hand we, as I have said, live in a world that is very cis-het normative. I'm sorry I had to change the batteries, but anyway, in my opinion, it's not, for example, the being sapphic that's the tricky part to write about a lesbian or bi character. I think the part that is hard to write is the experience with compet. It's not falling in love with any gender that's the part about bi and pan people that might be trickier to write compared to straight characters. It's the part where bi and pan people have to constantly deal with a denial of their sexuality. You kind of get the gist. You know, it's not the sexualities themselves, in my opinion, that are hard to write. It's the living in a discriminatory cis-het normative society. Take away those experiences and what you basically get is people being attracted to people, which if you're a good author, honestly should not be that hard to write. So what I'm saying is maybe stop writing heteronormative worlds, and maybe you'll suddenly find writing queer characters a lot easier because you don't have to consider their experiences with oppression anymore. Just saying. Although I do have to put a little caveat on that, because I do think there are queer identities, while they of course also have to deal with discrimination and cis heteronormativity, there might also be parts of their experiences that don't change too much within fantasy worlds. For example, I don't know for a trans person how much of their dysphoria is society induced, or how much would exist no matter how non-cis normative society were to be. You know, those types of elements. The same kind of goes for aromantic and asexual characters, who of course have their experiences with their sexuality being denied and discriminated against and so on. But I do also think that they have very unique experiences that, you know, maybe won't be as easily equated as, you know, falling in love with dudes, falling in love with gals, falling in love with non-binary people. It's basically all the same no matter who you are. Also, since I'm personally neither trans nor ace, but I'm bisexual, maybe those experiences are also farther removed from my own experience, so I don't feel as comfortable making as definitive of a statement about these experiences as I feel comfortable making a definitive statement about writing bisexual people. So if you're trans, if you're ace, feel free to share your thoughts on this topic in the comments down below. I would love to hear your viewpoint on this. How much you think your experiences would change in a completely different world. And also, of course, if you're bi, pan, gay, lesbian, maybe even straight, and you have your thoughts, maybe they're completely different to my thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments down below as well. So a few last thoughts before moving on. I think sometimes, even if it comes from a good place of just wanting to do queer characters justice, I think the refusal to write queer characters, or the feeling of it being too difficult to write queer characters, comes from a place of othering and ultimately from discrimination. Our world is so constructed around the heteronormative nuclear family that it can sometimes maybe be hard to believe that queer people just fall in love like anyone else, and that the experiences, the discriminations that make writing queer people so hard in contemporaries are just constructed, and that you as an author have the freedom to just not construct these differences into your fantasy worlds. It's as simple as that. And even aside from that, authors write characters who don't have the same experiences as them all the time. And if an author feels they can't do that for queer characters, then to be honest, that just means that that author doesn't see us as human as everyone else. And if you're worried about, you know, not doing it justice or whatever, talk to people, get sensitivity readers. And yes, more than one sensitivity reader, because, you know, there's a plethora of different queer experiences. There's as many different queer experiences as there are queer people. So it's really not that hard, or at least it shouldn't be. But now that we have that out of the way, let's move on to the next section. So as I said, the second part of the video is going to talk about queer world building, and in a second you're probably gonna call me a big fat hypocrite and gonna tell me that I'm saying the exact opposite of the things that I just said right now, but bear with me. Before we get into this part, I want to say that this part right now is secondary to everything I said just now. Because what I think is important is, first of all, to get the representation into the books, and then second, we can worry about how we get, or how we include that representation into our stories. And so basically what I'm saying, everything I'm saying from this point onwards is a bunch of pet peeves, and if you don't feel like they apply to you, then you can chuck them out the window. Also, all the pet peeves can be summarized under the umbrella of authors don't put enough thoughts into the immaterial parts of culture and society when it comes to their world building. Immaterial meaning, in this video, everything that's not for the aesthetic. And so the two big pet peeves I have are, first, authors not thinking how sexuality will influence the culture and society that they have built within their worlds, and the second one, authors being basic with their world building. Also, by the way, this second part is going to be exclusively about sexuality, because I will talk about gender and world building in my next video. So now let's start with authors not putting thought into how including sexuality in their worlds will influence the societies within their worlds. And I have seen the whole spectrum of authors make these mistakes. It doesn't really matter how openly queer the author is, it doesn't matter how much queerness they include in their society. I have seen more authors do this pet peeve of mine than I have seen authors not do this pet peeve of mine. What I have found authors will do is they will take a queer character, they will put said queer character into their world, they will have other characters who aren't queer not bat an eyelash that this character is queer, and they will call it a day because they have now created a queer normative world. So this can certainly sometimes actually be the case, as in a lot of N.K. Jemisin's works. However, the problem kind of becomes a problem when we then take a look at the broader world building and the broader world building of the cultures and society within the story. I have talked about it a few times on my channel already, how I don't think homosexuality being normalized in a society, in a world, is the same as said world being queer normative. The reason for that mostly has to do with implicit norms, implicit societal norms. The big example I always bring is how it's all fine and dandy if you have characters react as if heteronormativity isn't a thing. However, if you then have a society or a culture that is based on succession, mostly imperial type cultures, and that succession is then based on the bloodline, so you have to be the blood relative of whoever came before you, then that brings with it an implicit bias towards heterosexual relationships, because as long as the general human biology is the same in your world, in your fantasy world, then the likelihood of there being biological offspring of same gender couples is, I would say, on the lower side. And that is basically my pet peeve. Authors thinking world building is done just because you added queer characters to your story, but not thinking of the broader implications. As with the example of N.K. Jemisin earlier, there will of course be worlds where it's more important to think of the implications of queerness compared to other worlds. For example, if you have succession-based societies like imperial societies, you might have to put more thought into how queerness plays into that compared to, let's say, republics, where maybe familial bonds aren't as important. And that's also why I think the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin is a great example of a world that includes queer characters. Another great example of a world that is consciously queer normative is from The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick, which is right here behind me. And what they did basically is that they have this world where you have, I don't think it's a republic, but you basically have this kind of powerful families-centered world building. And a lot of times when you center world building around powerful families, of course blood bonds will become very important. However, what M.A. Carrick did is that they focused the familial bonds not on blood bonds, but on inclusion within the family register. And so kind of the blood relation is taken out of the equation, which then makes a queer normative world suddenly very possible. So that's just a great example if you wanna read a book with a great queer normative world. That was it for the first pet peeve. The second one is, please, to all the authors out there, please be more creative in your world building. Just pretty please. Once again, this pet peeve is mostly around how authors rarely make the step past including queer characters. Usually for world building you have two options. Either you have a homophobic world where queerness absolutely isn't normalized, or you have the option I just talked about of queerness being thought to be normalized. Sometimes it actually is, sometimes it actually isn't. Also, by the way, this pet peeve is a lot more personal compared to the other one, because the other one I feel has something to do with world building inconsistencies, whereas this one, I think a lot of people won't care about this as much as I do. The reason for that is because I just like to see and to take apart how cultures and societies tick differently, and that's just the thing. I want to see inclusion of queerness in different ways within different societies and different cultures. Maybe in some of them homosexuality can be an open secret, but no one is like, you know, really openly homosexual because it's a taboo. Maybe in other cultures homosexuality is a lot more normalized within the lower classes because they have less societal taboos they have to deal with compared to the higher classes. Maybe you could have a society that is based around the nuclear family, that is based around heterosexual marriage, but because, again, same-gender relationships don't tend to bring forth as many children as non-same-gender relationships, there's a certain normalization of homosexual relationships outside of marriage, either before marriage or as affair. There are so incredibly many different ways you can include queerness and different sexualities within your world building. Of course, the examples I just mentioned kind of tend to be on the side of heterosexuality rather than homosexuality, and tend to maybe at least implicitly, you know, discriminate against homosexuality. But those were just the example I said, because there are plenty of examples, and plenty of examples where you can have both homosexuality and heterosexuality be completely equal. And also I get why a lot of queer authors will say, no, I do not want to consciously write any type of discrimination against queer characters into my world building, because I get enough of that in real life, and I 100% support that. That is where I said this pet peeve is mostly just really personal to me, because I like digging deep into cultures and I like seeing different systems within cultures. Also, by the way, I have not even gotten into what other aspects of your world building can do for your queerness. So for example, I have not even gotten into what magic systems can do for queerness. For example, what if you have a magic system where same-gendered couples can get children? How would that change society? How would that change society's look on queerness? So it's not just always, when it comes to world building, it's not just always how does queerness change your society and what parts of society do you have to change for it to 100% be queer normative, but it's also how can your world building influence queerness. And yeah, there's just so many elements that I don't know why authors don't play with those elements more. One last thing, if you have multiple cultures within your world, please, at least marginally, have them have different views on queerness. Make it a little bit interesting in that way. And because I seem to not be able to stop talking about this series and seem to mention it in every single video of mine, the A Chorus of Dragons series by Jen Lyons right here behind me has multiple cultures, and every single culture acts differently towards queerness. Some are a little bit more discriminatory, others are completely equal, and I just love that. I appreciate that because it makes the world building interesting. And it's not always just about representation. Representation always comes first, but then as a second step, we can also think about how the representation can then improve the storytelling. So I think that was all the things I wanted to say about sexuality in fantasy. As I have mentioned multiple times already, if you have any thoughts on anything I said, or if you have anything to add, leave those thoughts in the comments down below. Also, if you can think of any ways to add queerness, to add sexuality into fantasy worlds that you haven't seen authors do yet, tell me those thoughts in the comments down below as well, because I'd be really interested to see with what ideas we can come up with. And with all of that said, I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. All the links to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will also be left in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!